Hello, and welcome to the Aquilani History Podcast with yours truly, Tayo Aquilani Bastards. It really is lovely to be back with you guys once again. I've missed you since the last series just concluded, the history of the Sokoto Caliphate, Rankadede. I really love recording that for you. The Hausa Fulani culture is such a rich one. They've got very many lovely traditions. Their language is just really sublime. They've got lovely food. The architecture is top notch, and they've got a really rich equestrian tradition as well. So Rankadede had everything from like cavalry charges to philosophical debates, from 40-foot walls to simple itinerant preacher going around the countryside. He had everything. It was amazing. Had all the elements of a beautiful story, and it's all true. So I really loved recording that for you, and I also loved the response so far. You guys have been like amazing, each and every one of you. I can't mention all the names. Some of you private messaged me asking how they could help, what they could do just to put the podcast out there, and I appreciate each and every one of you from all over the world, wherever you're listening. I can't mention all the names, but obviously I see you, Dio and E. Thank you so very much. Big Daddy T and Mommy Tree. You guys are fantastic. Nelly, Damoche Escalante. Love you guys. Best sisters anyone could wish for. Edafe, Alakpomeji, Libialis Esculentus. I see you guys. Thank you so much. Fizzle, my boo. Lamidizzle, my Apodorian, you're adoring. I tried to rhyme there, but I'm not sure if that made all the sense. But I can't mention all the names. These are all real people, by the way. They're not my imaginary friends. Thank you all for your support and your well wishes, your comments, your suggestions, your likes, your retweets. Everything means a whole lot to me, and I appreciate it so much. Thank you. If you liked Rankadede, the history of Sokoto Caliphate, then the next one is going to be right down your alley, and I hope it's going to knock your socks off. It's the history of Lagos. I mean, this one is good, if I say so myself. I'm not the one to toot my own horn. And perhaps I'm really biased because obviously Lagos is my home. I hail from Lagos Island. So I'm absolutely partial, and I'm not ashamed to say it. Like, hold me down, put a stats to my chest, and that's all the evidence that you need. You'd hear the love. So yeah, this one is really close to me, but it really is an intriguing story. It's got everything. It's like Game of Thrones meets Pirates of the Caribbean. It's got very rich naval history, lots of political intrigue. It's got a love triangle in there somewhere, and it's got some really brutal and stark, quite dark truths about the role that African monarchs had to play in slave trade. So this series is already available on my YouTube channel, and I'm just adapting it for the podcast. There are very few original sources, written records that have survived to date, so a lot of it is based on oral traditions. There's always a bit of bias when you're telling history. I have tried to be as unbiased as possible, but definitely some of my bias would come through, and I've tried to unify timelines as much as possible. But in terms of the crux of what happened is still the same. The kingdoms which reigned suzerain over Lagos, and how all the battles, for instance, and most of the timelines actually agree with most of the sources. So if this is not the account that you are 100% used to, please don't come at me, or maybe do. You're an adult, I can't tell you what to do, but please listen, please enjoy, in whichever way you usually would enjoy your podcast, driving on your commute, or cleaning up the house with a loved one, with a glass of red wine, maybe Coke. I'm not trying to push any products. I'm not being paid for mentioning any products. Anyways, I think we should delve in now. This is a 4-part series on the history of Lagos. I hope you enjoy it as much as I have researching it and producing it for you. Come with me. Let's dive in. Lagos. If you picked a word any word to describe the city, it will probably be true. Great, mad, beautiful, ugly. Lagos is many different things to its 22 million residents, but its significance has bearings far beyond its small borders. It always has. However you choose to see it, the former capital of Nigeria remains in very many regards the most important city, and arguably the most important in Africa as well. By itself, it would be the 7th largest economy in Africa. It is a melting pot of cultures, ideas, people, and trade. Its history is very intriguing, but its beginnings way humbler than one might imagine. Our history is steeped deep in drama, rising from the status of a simple pepper farm to a lowly vassal state, before then amassing great wealth and power, sometimes, actually a lot of the times, through very dark and inhumane means, and then being almost completely undone by a very bitter family struggle for the control of a growing influence. It is a story of how time-defining events occurring at far-flung corners of the world intersected with a dynastic family feud at a pivotal moment which determined the fate of Lagos. It is a dark tale of slave trade, of immense wealth and power, and the destructive lust to keep it at any cost. But we must not get ahead of ourselves. No, not just yet. If you were a traveller in the 14th century sailing past the coast of West Africa, you will not be blamed if you missed altogether a tiny village on a tiny island on the edge of the vast Atlantic. Very insignificant and probably not worth anyone's trouble. The fortunes of this tiny island were about to improve though, because a combination of factors relating to its geography, the surrounding kingdoms and the times had been coming into alignment for decades. To understand them, we must take a step backwards to appreciate the bigger picture and be introduced to some bigger players. You see, Lagos is situated at this very spot, and that is incredibly important. Because on the coast of West Africa there exists two main water highways. One was the Atlantic Ocean itself, which could sometimes be very rough, and the other was a series of coastal rivers not far from and running parallel to the shore. The Lagos Channel and Lagoon was the only natural inlet from the sea that connected these two waterways. We know trade had flowed along the internal waterways for centuries. Ivory from Benin, cloth from Ijebu had found its way to Ouidah and other coastal markets, whilst the Portuguese, followed by the Dutch and the English, traded from the Atlantic and would come to dominate it. So we have the oceans dominated by Europeans and the coastal rivers dominated by African kingdoms, and the only natural permanent connection between these two water systems for several hundreds of miles was the Lagos Lagoon, and at its gate lay the island of Lagos. The influential players in those days were the Benin Empire to the east, who were militaristic and proud and not to be messed with. The Ijebus were to the north of Lagos, controlled top of the lagoon and therefore access to the coast. Further north to Ijebu was a domineering and powerful Oyo Empire. They were the heavyweights of the Yoruba kingdoms, very Spartan and conquest loving. Between the Ijebus and the Oyos were the Egbas and Owus. Not very important at this time, but give it a century or so and things will start to get interesting. To the west lay the Alada and Dahomey empires, and of course to the south was the Atlantic Ocean itself, and 16th century open ocean meant ships, European ships. Now we must focus again on our tiny island and go back in time many hundred years ago to a very sparsely populated fishing camp where nothing happened and frankly nobody cared. From before the 1500s, the Aworis, a group of Yoruba-speaking peoples, had been settling in a town called Isheri, about 20 kilometers north of Lagos Island. They had travelled there from Ile-Ife, the ancestral home of Yoruba-speaking people. They travelled across the land and down the Ogun River. By about 1580, a party of these Aworis, led by a certain Olofi Ogunfunminire and his 32 sons and their families, left Isheri and travelled southward, first to a place of 3 landings, what we now know today as Ebutemeta, and then to a small island off of it called Ido. These days, Ido is no longer an island as the landfill has connected it to the Lagos mainland. In Ido, Olofin became the ruler over the indigenous people already living there and set up a decentralized confederacy of settlements branching out from Ido and ultimately controlled by him through 11 of his sons and grandsons. Together, they formed the beginnings of the aristocracy, the Egbe Aladejo, the Idejo chieftains, some of them with names easily recognizable 500 years later, like the Elegushi, Onikoyi, Oniru, and Oluwa. They became the landowners and pioneered establishment of new settlements. They arbitrated disputes amongst their subjects, regulated fishing use and land use as well. Lagos Island itself was uninhabited at this point in time. The Idejos began to settle it as a red pepper farm, but it would soon expand to become the nucleus and center of power of their dynasty. This confederal period was not to last for very long. It was by now the 1600s, and this was a period of increasing trade with the Europeans. To start with, trade was of a legitimate nature, and the Benin Empire was eager to maximize their profits. To supplant the Ijebus and deny them easy access to the coast, the Benins moved downstream and expanded towards Lagos. They established a permanent war camp in Lagos from as early as 1603. This enabled them to control all the trade coming out of Lagos and Lekki lagoons. The king of Benin, Oba Orugboa, appointed his grandson Esikpa, in Yoruba known as Ashikpa, as the first Iliko of Iko, displacing Olofin's children, the Idejos, as the primary rulers of Lagos. When Ashikpa died, his son Ado returned the body of his father to Benin for burial, starting a tradition that would continue for another 2 centuries. In return, the king of Benin confirmed him as the next king of Lagos. Thereafter, Lagos remained a subject to the Oba of Benin, and the deceased kings of Lagos had to be buried in Benin, except for the heads which remained interred in Lagos. This had to be done before the new king could then be confirmed by the Oba of Benin. Ado therefore returned to Lagos with his own administrative setup, including a new class of chiefs called the Akarigberes, the most important of them being the Eletu. The Eletu would become the preeminent of the kingmakers, determining in which direction a dynasty would proceed. The Akarigbere were all of Benin descent, and thus more closely tied to the new dynasty than the original Idejo chieftains. By now, that horrible trade in human beings was starting to ramp up, but Lagos was not considered as a major port of call for slave traders just yet. Even though she had the only major and permanent inlet to the internal waterways, the channel of entry was quite treacherous to cross due to a bar across the beach. This was a shallow accumulation of sand in the waters which made heavier ships run aground. This bar lent its name to the famous Bar Beach of Lagos. More importantly, Lagos at this time did not have a steady supply of slaves, not just yet. The main suppliers of slaves were the Oyo, who preferred the Porto Novo and Badagry ports. Dahomey was another supplier of slaves, but they preferred the Ouidah and Jachin ports, and the Benin Empire also had their own ports. Moreover, Lagos did not have any connections with any of the prime slave traders. All of this began to slowly change when one of the princes of Lagos, Akin Semoy, was exiled to Badagry by his brother Gabaro. Whilst in exile, he befriended the Brazilian slave traders who as businessmen only saw the benefits of being in the good books of a potential ruler of a rising power. Their gamble proved to be profitable because true enough, Akin Semoy was recalled to Lagos on the death of his brother Gabaro to become its new king, and as early as 1766, Lagos had 4 ambassadors in Brazil. Slave trade began to kick off in earnest. However, Lagos was still being outcompeted by her rivals. By 1780, the reigning king of Lagos at this time, Ologun Kutere, rightly surmised that diplomacy alone was not enough, and he began to build a powerful fleet of war canoes. Each was capable of carrying 100 armed men with muskets and guns, and the boat itself was armed at the front with a swiveling cannon. Ologun's plan was simple. If you don't have as many goods to sell, you could burn the shop of your competitors. So Lagos began to raid and disrupt trade at the neighbouring ports. The closest and weakest was Badagry, which was destroyed twice in 1784 and 1793 and was made a subject to Lagos. This left Porto Novo and Ouidah as the other competitors. The Dahomians who controlled the Ouidah port basically kicked themselves in the head.
They knew Lagos was getting more and more powerful and that Lagos probably had sights on Porto Novo, so they attacked it first. But all this fighting and disruption put off many Europeans. Also, the trade at the Dahomey ports was very centrally controlled, with many fees and duties controlled by the king and his agents, who had a total monopoly. This was very unlike in Lagos, where slave trade was deregulated and therefore more profitable, so the slave traders began to drift closer and closer to Lagos. From about 1804, far from the coast and deep in the Sahel, the Fulani Jihad in the Sokoto Caliphate was in full swing and expanding rapidly. The northern Yoruba cities of Ilorin and Old Oyo were overrun by the new caliphate, causing a massive displacement of the populace. This had a domino effect as the Oyo refugees began looking for new homes, and with the help of Ife and Ijebu, the displaced Oyos completely ravaged 150 Egba and Owu towns. The Egbas only stopped fleeing when they arrived at Abeokuta, sheltering around the Olumo Rock and the surrounding hills. Here they established themselves as a rising power, taking the fight back to their enemies. Thus ensued a period of almost a century of constant warfare in the Yoruba hinterland. For Lagos, this only meant that business was booming. War meant a steady supply of slaves, slaves meant more money, and more money meant more power. Abhorrent as it may sound, this was heavenly bliss for Lagos. At least it should have. This should have meant prosperity, stability, and growth, and it did for a while. But fate can be very mischievous, which is very lucky for me, as stable kingdoms make for very boring history. To spice this story up, we will soon be introduced to a couple of massive egos, and then we get to throw in competing half-brothers and partisan chiefs who are willing to protect only their interest. And then we'll also throw in two men competing for the love of a woman, and boy, do we have all the ingredients for a royal smackdown to make Game of Thrones look like child's play. And that is not even the end of it. The British are getting ready to be involved because that's just what they did then. Britannia did rule the waves after all.
Okay, and that brings us to the end of the very first episode of the History of Lagos series. This has been the Little Pepper Farm, part 1 of the History of Lagos. I hope you enjoyed it. It's shaping up to be something, isn't it? I can't wait to release the second episode, which is titled We Three Kings, and that's part 2. It's going to be explosive. As always, I love your support. I treasure your support. Thank you for being with me so far. But please follow the podcast. It's really going to go a long way into supporting me. It's a one-man production team and I need every bit of help that I can get. So please follow, please give it a like. There's a Q&A session at the end of every episode. If you could put some comments on there for me, just engage in whatever way you can. Tell your friends about it, share it on your stories, tweet it, put it on your Instagrams, just put the word out there. Every little bit helps. I really love spending time with you guys here, and I hope the feeling is mutual. So if you want us to keep doing this, no one has to know. No, actually, everyone has to know. Please tell all your friends and share as much as you can. I will see you hopefully within the week with part 2 of the History of Lagos. Stay safe, everyone. Be well, and see you soon. Thank you.